The envelope was already on the table when they brought out the cake. Nora Sutcliffe noticed it first, not because she was looking for trouble, but because she was 8 years old and bored. And bored children notice everything that adults have already decided isn't worth their attention. She was sitting at the far end of the long dining table in the Alderton room of the Ridgecrest Club, wedged between her grandmother's empty chair and a potted fern that smelled faintly of cigarettes. Her mother had gone to speak with someone near the bar 20 minutes ago and hadn't come back. The speeches were still going. The man at the head of the table, her grandmother's employer, the man whose retirement party this was laughing at something the silver-haired woman to his left had said, and the sound of his laugh rolled through the room like something that expected to be heard. His name was Theodore Alderton, 64 years old, senior partner emeritus of Alderton Marsh LLP, a name that appeared on the sides of buildings in downtown Halifax. He had kind eyes and a blue pocket square, and the particular ease of a man who had spent 40 years being the most important person in every room he entered. Nora had met him once before at Christmas, when he had shaken her hand very seriously and asked her what she was reading. She had told him she was reading a book about wolves, and he had said gravely that wolves were underestimated. She had liked him for that. She liked him enough that when she saw what she saw, she didn't look away. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, the kind that felt important in your hands. It had been slipped beneath the small arrangement of white roses at Theodore's place setting while the lights were dimmed for the slideshow. Nora had been watching the roses because she was tracing the pattern on the tablecloth with her finger, and the roses were in her sight line. She saw the hand, just the hand, reaching from behind the floral arrangement, sliding the envelope under the stems with a precision that was not accidental. Then the hand was gone. She looked up. The lights were still down. The slideshow was playing photographs of Theodore at various ages, young and serious in a courtroom, middle-aged and laughing on a dock somewhere, older now, standing with a group of people in what looked like a mountain pass. No one was looking at the table. No one was looking at Nora. She looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the hand, which belonged to a woman now standing 3 feet away, very still, watching the slideshow with an expression of composed interest. The woman's name was Audrey Fenn. Nora knew this because her grandmother had mentioned it. Audrey Fenn, Theodore's executive assistant, 30 years with the firm, practically family. She was somewhere in her late 50s, with iron-gray hair cut close to her head and a way of standing that suggested she was always slightly ahead of wherever she was going. Nora looked back at the envelope. There was something wrong with it. She couldn't have said, at 8 years old, exactly what wrong looked like in an envelope. But she had read enough books to know that the things people slid under flowers when the lights were down were not usually the things you were supposed to see. And Audrey Fenn's face was the face of someone watching a door, not a slideshow. The lights came back up. The room filled with applause. Someone began carrying in the cake. 3 tiers, a small Canadian flag on top, candles already lit, and the attention of every adult in the room swung toward the head of the table where Theodore Alderton was rising from his chair, looking genuinely surprised, which meant he had known all along. Nora slipped out of her seat. She reached the head of the table just as the cake arrived from the other side. Theodore was shaking hands with the man who had given the longest speech, the one about legacy and mentorship and the particular courage required to build something that outlasts you. Nora stood at the edge of his peripheral vision and waited. He noticed her. People like Theodore Alderton always noticed children standing patiently at the edges of things, because they had learned that children standing patiently at these edges of things were either about to say something very funny or something very true. He bent slightly. "Miss Sutcliffe," he said, "are you enjoying the party?" "There's an envelope under your roses," Nora said. "Someone put it there during the slideshow." "I saw." Theodore straightened slightly. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It simply sharpened, the way a photograph sharpens when you adjust the lens. "Did you?" "I saw the hand," Nora said. "I saw whose hand it was." "Nora." Her mother's voice came from behind her, apologetic and slightly mortified. Caroline Sutcliffe appeared at her daughter's shoulder, one hand already reaching. "I'm so sorry, It's perfectly all right," Theodore said, and his voice was warm, but his eyes were still on Nora. "We were just talking." He looked at the roses. Then he looked back at his plate, at the envelope lying half visible beneath the white stems, and something moved across his face that Nora couldn't read. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "I was going to open it," he said carefully, speaking still to Nora, as though her mother weren't there. "After the cake? I think you shouldn't," Nora said. Caroline Sutcliffe's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. "Nora, sweetheart, why not?" Theodore asked. He was not asking to be polite. He was asking because he actually wanted to know. "Because of how it got there," Nora said. The table around them had drifted back into conversation. The cake was being set down, candles flickering in the ventilated air of the Ridgecrest Club. No one was paying attention to a man in a blue pocket square crouching slightly to speak with an 8-year-old girl, except Audrey Fenn, who was standing 12 feet away with a glass of sparkling water, and whose eyes, Nora noticed, were not on the cake. Theodore followed Nora's gaze across the room. He looked at Audrey. "I can do that." Then he looked back at Nora, and something passed between them that didn't need language, the particular understanding that sometimes exists between people who have both noticed the same thing in a room full of people who haven't. "Caroline," he said, straightening now, his voice pleasant and carrying nothing. "Would you mind finding Graham for me? My assistant, Graham Lowe, tall fellow, gray jacket. Tell him I'd like a word before the cake." Caroline Sutcliffe looked between her employer's employer and her daughter and made the calculation that had kept her employed for 11 years. "Of course," she said. She moved away. Theodore sat back down in his chair. He did not touch the envelope. He set his hands on the table beside his plate, and he looked at the candles on the cake, and he said very quietly, still not looking at Nora, "Tell me exactly what you saw." Nora told him. She was precise about it, the way children are precise when they know they are being taken seriously. The timing, the hand, the angle, the way Audrey Fenn had moved back to her place with the particular stillness of someone who has just finished doing something. Theodore listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not something most adults did. When she finished, he said, "You're certain?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The envelope could be nothing," he said. "A card, a note." "It could be," Nora said. "But you don't think so?" "I think if it was a card, she would have just given it to you." Theodore looked at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "That's sound reasoning," he said. Graham Lowe arrived, tall, gray jacket, exactly as described, with Caroline Sutcliffe 2 steps behind him, looking professionally neutral. Theodore spoke to Graham in a low voice for approximately 45 seconds. Graham did not change his expression. He nodded once, and then he was gone again, moving around the edge of the room toward the door that led to the private reception corridor. Nora returned to her seat at the far end of the table. The cake was cut. The candles were blown out to a round of applause. Theodore stood and gave a short speech about gratitude and the people who had made his career worth having, and he looked, throughout, like a man completely at ease with the world, which Nora understood now was a particular skill. The ability to look calm while something important was happening underneath the surface, the way a lake looks still even when the current is running hard beneath. Audrey Fenn left the room at 8:47. Nora noted the time because she had been watching the clock above the door, counting down until she could reasonably ask her mother when they were leaving. She saw Audrey set down her glass on a passing tray and move through the side door with the same precise, purposeful walk she always had. The walk of a woman going somewhere she needed to be. Graham Lowe was already in the corridor. Nora knew this only because her grandmother, Estelle Sutcliffe, returned to her seat 20 minutes later with the particular expression she wore when she had overheard something she wasn't supposed to and hadn't yet decided whether to be satisfied by it. Estelle Sutcliffe was 71 years old and had worked as Theodore Alderton's house manager for 9 years. And she had learned in that time that you could understand almost everything about a situation by watching the rooms adjacent to the one where the situation was happening. "Well," Estelle said, settling into her chair and reaching for her water glass as though nothing at all had happened. "That was interesting." Nora said nothing. She watched the door. At 9:15, 2 men arrived. They wore dark clothes and had the kind of quiet authority that didn't announce itself. One of them spoke briefly with the maitre d'. The other stood near the window and looked at his phone with the patient expression of someone who was not actually looking at their phone. At 9:20, Theodore excused himself from the table. He was gone for 40 minutes. When he came back, he sat down, folded his pocket square carefully, and looked at Nora across the length of the table until she looked up and met his eyes. He nodded once. The kind of nod that means, "You were right, and it mattered, and I won't forget it." Nora went back to tracing the pattern on the tablecloth. What had been in the envelope, what Nora would understand only later, in pieces, as the adults around her decided which parts of the truth were appropriate for an 8-year-old, was this: a document. 12 pages, printed on the firm's own letterhead, with Theodore's signature already affixed to the final page. A signature that, if the document had been filed with the relevant authorities before the end of the fiscal quarter, would have transferred the controlling interest in Alderton Marsh LLP's Halifax Property Trust, a trust worth somewhere north of $40 million, to a numbered company registered in Alberta, which was itself registered to a company in the Cayman Islands, which was, through a series of steps that the RCMP would spend the better part of 4 months untangling, ultimately connected to a man named Brennan Culp, who was a client Alderton Marsh had represented and then declined to continue representing. 8 years prior on the grounds of professional ethics. The signature was not Theodore's. It was close. Very close. The work of someone who had spent time studying the way he signed his name, which required access to documents that only someone inside the firm could have had. But it was not his. Audrey Fenn had been with the firm for 32 years. She had access to everything. She had also, as the investigation revealed, been receiving payments from a shell company associated with Brennan Culp for the past 4 years. Modest amounts, small enough not to attract attention, consistent enough to suggest a long arrangement with a specific endpoint. The retirement party had been the endpoint. Theodore's signature on the document, witnessed by 2 of the party guests who had been recruited, without knowing what they were witnessing, would have been difficult to contest. The transfer would have cleared before anyone noticed. All of it, the 4 years of payments, the forged signature, the carefully chosen witnesses, the envelope slid under the roses at precisely the moment the lights went down. Undone because an 8-year-old girl had been watching a flower arrangement while the slideshow played. Theodore spoke about it publicly only once, at a small lunch the following spring, hosted by the Halifax Bar Association. He was brief about the mechanics of it. He spent more time on something else. There is a particular kind of attention that children have, he said, before the world teaches them, to sort what is worth noticing from what isn't. They haven't yet learned to assume that the things happening in front of them are probably fine. They look at everything. They assume that anything could be important. He paused. I benefited from that, and I am aware that I am not in the habit of paying it the respect it deserves. Graham Lowe, who was sitting in the 3rd row, wrote something down. Nora did not attend the lunch. She was in school. But Estelle Sutcliffe attended, and she came home that evening with the same carefully neutral expression she had worn at the party. And she told Nora, who was doing homework at the kitchen table, that Mr. Alderton had mentioned her in his remarks. Nora looked up from her math problems and waited for more information. Estelle said there was also something in the mail for her and slid an envelope across the table. This one was cream-colored too. Thick. The kind that feels important in your hands. Nora opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten on plain white paper. Not firm letterhead, not anything official, just a man's handwriting on a page, and a document from a law office in Halifax establishing an education trust in the amount of $75,000 held in Nora Sutcliffe's name, to be released when she turned 18. The letter said what the nod across the table had meant to say, but in more words. That she had been precise and brave, and that being believed is something children deserve and adults owe, and that he hoped she would use the money for whatever she decided to build. Because people who paid attention to the right things at the right moments were exactly the kind of people the world needed more of. Nora read it twice. Then she set it on the table and went back to her math problems because she had 7 questions left, and her mother had told her she needed to finish before dinner. But she was thinking, underneath the arithmetic, about the envelope under the roses and the hand placing it there in the dark, and about how much can go wrong in a single unguarded moment, and how much can go right if someone is watching.